I'm making a video about the geopolitical implications of what's going on between China and Taiwan right now. That's a whole separate thing. Just collecting some information. I should have that out today. But right now I want to focus on the differences between what is the Chinese Navy and the U.S. Navy. Now, I'm not going to include the Taiwanese Navy or the Japanese Navy, which obviously would come together with the U.S. if this were to be an actual fight that took place in the South China Sea, a naval battle. There would be others as well. I'm sure Britain, Australia, all would be involved, Philippines. It would be a significant disadvantage for China, but it is still their region, so there is some advantages the Chinese have. But we'll talk about that here, specifically for a naval engagement. The Chinese armed forces consists of three major organizations, each of which have a maritime subcomponent. The first is the People's Liberation Army. That's their main component, and that contains the People's Liberation Army Navy. The People's Armed Police is what manages China's maritime law enforcement, and this includes China's Coast Guard as well as China's their maritime militia forces, which is called the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia. Each of these different sectors are actually by vessel the largest in the world, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the most powerful or the most capable. Having the most boats doesn't really matter. It's like having the most bullets. It just depends on how good you can fire them and what they're being fired from. Now, China has the world's largest navy in terms of vessels. They have nearly 400 vessels currently floating. While Chinese warships may not match individual capabilities of their American counterparts, the sheer numbers do play a significant role in maintaining their presence and influence in the region. So the difference between China's aims with its navy is trying to preserve or even create dominance in the South China Sea. And this is key because China isn't creating an expeditionary navy. It's not creating a navy that can control the world. It's just trying to create a navy that can control its region. It knows that it can't match the U.S. on the global stage, so it tries to do what it can to defend itself in the South China Sea. It wants to control and police all the resources and all the islands and whatever is and all the trade within the South China Sea as its own territory, as its so-called 9-dash line gives it. Now, that's a Chinese self-imposed system. It doesn't follow international rules when it comes to the law of the seas, but that's still something they believe. Now, the U.S. operates what's considered an expeditionary and globally dominant navy. As it stands, the U.S. can bring about 4 times more naval firepower to the fight than the Chinese can. But the U.S. Navy is distributed globally, whereas the Chinese Navy and Coast Guard is concentrated in and around the South China Sea. The composition of the Chinese Navy relative to the U.S. Navy is growing. China is growing its capability, but it's still not nearly as capable as the U.S. China has 3 aircraft carriers, 2 of which are currently in service. One is going undergoing testing and fitting right now. It was just launched in 2022. The 2 that are currently deployed are jump carriers or ski jump carriers or ramp carriers. And there's a difference between the catapult carriers that operate in the United States versus those ramp or jump carriers. The newest version of the Chinese carrier is a catapult carrier, but it is not fielded completely yet or ready for service. It just was launched last year. China does have 1 helicopter carrier, and those play a part, especially for places like Japan, who actually are converting their helicopter carriers into F-35 vertical takeoff carriers, and that's a significant improvement. That actually bolsters Japanese Navy by a significant measure. China does not have that vertical takeoff capability like the F-35. The U.S. has 11 modern catapult carriers. Again, this is obviously 8 more carriers than the Chinese field, and all 11 are catapult carriers for the U.S. The U.S. fields 9 helicopter carriers. In fact, the U.S. has more aircraft carriers than the rest of the world combined. And furthermore, the ski jump or ramp carriers are limited because their aircraft do not have as long a range and cannot carry as heavy a payload because they have to use their own power to ramp off the carrier, whereas a U.S. carrier can catapult it using that catapult system to push the fighter jet off the platform. It means that the U.S. aircraft on carriers both outrange and carry a deadlier payload than the Chinese or the Russian carriers until China fields its 1 catapult carrier. Now, this is partly why China is developing man-made islands across the South China Sea to try and be able to launch longer-range fighters from land rather than relying on jump carriers. The other reason they're building these islands is to extend their territorial waters by creating land out in the South China Sea, then planting their flag and saying, this is now our land, extend the waters outward. It's kind of a bullshit way of doing things, but that's what they're doing. From a submarine standpoint, the U.S. has both more advanced and quieter subs than China, with the Seawolf and Virginia-class submarines leading the way. Weirdly, North Korea has the most submarines at 71, but 61 of those are small coastal subs or mini-subs. China operates about 59 subs, but only 6 are the quieter and more capable nuclear-powered submarines. Diesel submarines have pretty significant limitations from their noise, which a Virginia-class submarine is about as loud as standing next to a food processor, whereas a Chinese sub is as loud as a chainsaw or an ambulance siren. Diesel submarines have to come back up to the surface to recharge its batteries. Now, they don't operate the diesel engine underwater. It has to operate to charge batteries, then they dive. So you can only stay under as long as that battery is charged. And in a submarine fight or where you're in a hunter situation, you have to surface, you're basically dead at that point. Whereas U.S. nuclear subs don't have to submerge or resurface. They only have to resurface to get food or something like that for the people on the submarine. Diesel submarines are less powerful. They submerge slower. They have range limitations because they have to be refueled, whereas nuclear submarines can last a long, long time. They just need to be resupplied with the needs of the sailors on the ship, on the vessel. And then also, diesel submarines require more maintenance, so obviously less capable. The U.S. has 71 destroyers, including 3 stealth destroyers. The Chinese have 41 destroyers, but the rest of its larger navy is just smaller gunboats that operate more in a coastal realm. China does operate the world's largest coast guard. It has about 1,300 boats, but 1,050 of those are just small gunboats, or what they call near-shore craft, which 250 are larger vessels capable of operating offshore, and that's one of the ones they're going to be using, these offshore vessels, to conduct these inspections. China poses 2 of the world's largest Coast Guard ships. They're quite significant, but again, it's not relative to a naval fleet. These Coast Guard ships are great for criminal activity near China. They're just not great for open ocean fighting. The Chinese maritime militia is the world's largest maritime militia, and they are the ones that are used in sovereignty disputes. They're trained. The people who operate these boats are trained and equipped and organized by the local military commands of the Chinese Navy, basically. So they answer to the PLA chain of command when activated for missions such as conducting their pseudo blockades or trying to interdict boats that are close to their claimed islands that they built. But the maritime militia generally falls under the police forces, and they do have numerous numbers, but they also have a lot of incidents where they fire upon vessels and then end up getting destroyed by some other navy. However, the Chinese quietly sweep it under the rug because the maritime militia isn't supposed to be operating that way. So this maritime militia really is designed to engage in what they call gray zone operations, and that's basically trying to create a sovereign space for China to operate freely in other countries' waters, such as the Philippines, Taiwan, Vietnam. Many countries have expressed both formal complaints and concerns, just general concerns about China's island building. It's kind of interesting because some of the Chinese islands, their manufacturing of these islands is poor, so they're sinking lately. So the reality is China's trying to build islands, trying to build out its navy, because it knows that its naval forces are very weak compared to the United States, and it's primarily focused on the periphery of island chains to maintain control. The Chinese do know that were the U.S. Navy to come to bear in the region in a naval conflict, China would be outmatched, which is why they're trying to reduce that threat through island building as well as bolstering their navy. But I don't foresee that happening for a while, if ever. And by a while, I mean at least a decade or two. So we'll see.